Steven Pinker is a professor of psychology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His books include The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, and The Blank Slate. I interviewed him in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I guess I have to start with a question that will be on everyone's mind, which is, what's the story with the hair?
Well, when I was a teenager, I had to get my hair cut, and now no one can force me to cut my hair.
Okay.
And so
you've had it a long time.
Yeah, I have.
Back
there were some bad times in the 80s when I felt really, really out of style, and so I actually cut it quite a bit shorter, years after everyone else did.
I see.
And then the 90s were a good decade. Grunge came in, and
Right.
it was okay again.
So
then
and there's Kenny G, too.
That's right. There's Yanni.
Yeah. Okay, now that we've got that out of the way. You are an evolutionary psychologist. Do you have a good kind of one or two sentence definition of evolutionary psychology?
Evolutionary psychology, I think, is just bringing to bear on the study of the mind constraints from evolution. So ideally, evolutionary psychology, I think, should disappear. It should just become part of psychology. For the same reason that in psychology now, the brain is becoming part of psychology. There is this discipline called cognitive neuroscience, which tries to bring the brain to bear on the study of the mind. And I think most people think that eventually it will just merge with psychology, and I hope the same thing will happen to evolutionary psychology.
And you think it's such a natural merger because, after all, the brain was created by natural selection, so...
Exactly. You can't really understand anything, especially something that shows signs of complex design, without thinking, how did it get there? And why does it have the organization that we see? Why did the brain develop the way it did, as opposed to the thousands of ways we could imagine that it may have developed, but it didn't? This is something that is routine in the rest of psychology. In perception, for example, you take it for granted that the whole perceptual system isn't just some arbitrary machine, but was constructed for a purpose, so to speak, not a divine purpose that was deliberately engineered by some conscious being, but the equivalent that we know that natural selection can build in the rest of the body. You just take it for granted that the reason that we have stereo vision is so that we can see in depth and we don't bump into trees or fall off cliffs. Or you take it for granted that in memory, whatever flaws there might be, the fact that I can't remember everything that I want to on a moment's notice is there because any information retrieval system would just get glutted with information unless it had some kind of bottleneck to differentiate between what's useful and what's useless. So the whole idea of usefulness, utility, function, purpose, we take it for granted in cognitive psychology, which is my field of training, things like memory and vision and language. And I think evolutionary psychology is seen as a separate field just because it tries to do that for areas of psychology like social interaction or the moral sense, where no one before ever bothered asking the question, what is it for? What's it designed to do? Okay.
Now, it sounds like a pretty innocuous enterprise as you've described it, and yet it's aroused a certain amount of controversy. And I think you believe that some of the controversy is grounded in some misconceptions about the field. Most people in the field seem to think that.
Yeah.
Are there some basic misconceptions that you can tick off?
Yeah, there are a number of misconceptions. One of them is that if you seek the adaptive basis for a particular aspect of the mind, then you're also committed to saying that every aspect of the mind was naturally selected and is there for some evolutionary purpose. And I certainly don't think that's true. I don't think that music, for example, has any adaptive function, or at least none that anyone has been able to make a convincing argument for. The content of dreams, despite a century in which people have tried to figure out what dreaming is for all we know, dreaming might be a kind of screensaver that doesn't really matter what the content is as long as certain parts of the brain are active. So those are just two examples of things that may not be adaptations but might be byproducts. Nonetheless, there's a misconception that evolutionary psychology says that everything is adaptive.
Right.
Another one is that that if you believe that the genes as selected by the evolutionary process shape some aspects of behavior or emotion or thinking, then you're committed to determinism, that we're somehow wind-up dolls or marionettes that are genetically programmed to carry out certain actions regardless of any input from the environment, which is just crazy, for one thing, because any intelligent organism has to take in information about the environment if it's going to stay intelligent.
And it's the genes that kind of help it do that, presumably. I mean, the program for accepting environmental information is presumably in the genes.
Something has to be in the genes. The buck's got to stop somewhere. And in fact, this is how I personally got interested in the idea that some things are innate and therefore shaped by natural selection. My background is in language acquisition, and I started off trying to model how children acquire their mother tongue in the first few years of life.
Right.
And to do that, you've got to build something in, if only the mechanisms that do the learning. And it's just, I think, a logical requirement that you can't have learning without a learning device. And so it's really the learning device that's innate, and the motives that power it, not the actual content.
Right.
Also, I think I've noticed a funny feature of intellectual life, that people, I think, are really used to thinking that there is nothing whatsoever that's innate. And whenever anyone suggests that there is some effect of the genes, that immediately gets translated into the idea that everything is in the genes.
Right.
The idea that, say, half the variation in personality traits is genetic, which is what behavioral geneticists tell us, something that's very hard for people to accept. Whenever I mention in a talk or in class between 1/4 and 3/4 of the variation in some trait is genetic, the immediate response is, oh, so you're saying it's all in the genes, even though 25 to 75% is not all, it's some.
And another kind of misconception I've encountered is the conflation of evolutionary psychology with what you just mentioned, behavioral genetics. Behavioral genetics is the study of genetic variation among people. That sometimes figures into evolutionary psychology, but more fundamentally, you're looking at universals among people everywhere, right?
That's right. I mean, evolutionary psychology is really the study of a universal human nature. And most evolutionary psychologists attribute differences among people to the environment, not to the genes.
Right.
In the case of language, what people actually say is going to vary radically because of the environment. I mean, the reason that some people speak Japanese and others people speak Yiddish and others speak Swahili has nothing whatsoever to do with the genes. It just depends on where you grew up. But underneath all of that variation, there may be, in the case of language, what Noam Chomsky called a universal grammar, something much more abstract than the actual rules of a particular language. And this universal grammar presumably bears the stamp of the learning abilities that allow particular languages to be acquired. And one of the recurring messages in evolutionary psychology is that if you look superficially at how people move their muscles and what they actually say, human behavior is going to vary all over the map. But if you try to boil it down to the underlying motives, then you might find much more universal signs of human nature. What's likely to be universal, what's likely to be innate, what's likely to be a product of natural selection is not so much behavior, but emotions and patterns of thought.